Good morning, boys and girls. So this week we're going to work on adding and subtracting fractions with denominators of 10 and 100. You are still going to have to use some of the strategies that were learned last week with the converting between the tens and hundreds. So that's where we're going to start today before we get into your activities. So looking back, let's say that we had 4/10 and we wanted to convert it into a fraction that had hundreds or 100 on the bottom in the denominator form. To get from 10 to 100, we would have to multiply by 10. When you're finding those equivalent fractions, you're going to multiply the same thing on the top as you do on the bottom. So since we multiplied by 10 on the bottom, we're going to do the same thing on top. So then 4 times 10 is going to give us 40. So 4/10 is equivalent to 40 hundredths. Again, the same value, it's just written a different way, either with the tens or the hundredths. Now going the other way and converting from the hundredths to the tenths, let's say that we were given 70 hundredths and it wanted us to convert it into a fraction with a 10 as the denominator. So instead of multiplying, because we were going from 10 to 100, which is getting bigger, we're now going from 100 to 10, which is smaller. The only thing that we can divide by to get from 100 to 10 is going to be 10. So again, whatever we do on the bottom, we have to do the same thing on the top. So we're going to do 70 divided by 10. When we do so, that's going to give us 7. So 70 hundredths would be equal to or equivalent to 7/10. So thinking about getting into our adding and subtracting of the fractions, for example, you would have 3/10 plus 14 hundredths. So what you're going to have to do, boys and girls, with adding those fractions, you have to make sure that they have the same denominator. Since we have a 10 and we have 100, those are not going to be the same, so we are going to have to change one of them. With our hundredths, since it does not have a 0 on the end of this number, we cannot just cross the zeros off to make it into a tenth. If this had been 10 hundredths, we could have crossed those zeros off to make it 1/10. But since it's not a 0, we can't convert that hundredths. So that means we're going to have to stick with our tenths. To get it from 3/10 to make it equivalent to 100ths, we can look back and see what we did on top with multiplying it by 10. So in thinking about that, when I say 3 times 10, that's going to turn into 30. So I'm going to add that 0 behind the 3, giving it that extra value. Same thing on the bottom. Again, do not forget, same thing on top and the bottom. So since we're going to convert our 10 to 100, we're going to do 10 times 10, which would give you that 100 that you need. If you'd like to make these circles, or the zeros, whole, you're more than welcome to. I'm simply just doing the dotted lines just to represent that 3/10 is not changing the value. We're just changing tens into hundreds. That value stays the same. So now that we've converted our tens into hundreds, we now can just add across. In adding fractions, we remember that our hundredths is not, or our denominator is not going to change. So 100 plus 100 is going to stay as 100. Do not add those denominators. Your numerators, however, you do add together. So we're going to say 30 plus 14 is going to give us 44 hundredths. Same thing with subtraction, boys and girls. Let's say that we had 82 hundredths minus 4/10. So looking back as to what we did on top, we're going to do the same thing with the subtraction problem that we did with the addition. We need to start with our hundredths, see if we can simplify this down into a tenth. We cannot because there's no 0 on the end of that number. So again, we're going to have to change our tenths to make it into hundreds. So thinking about what we did with the 30 hundredths, we're going to multiply by 10 on the top and the bottom, the numerator and the denominator. So this 4/10 is going to turn into 40 hundredths. Again, I'm just dotting the zeros instead of making them whole, just to represent that yes, the fraction itself is changing, but the value is not. So now we have 82 hundredths minus 40 hundredths. Again, same thing with addition as it is subtraction. You are not going to change or subtract those denominators unless towards the end you do have to simplify. For now, boys and girls, I do want to let you know that with the adding and subtracting of fractions with denominators of 10 and 100, we are not going to simplify these. The only simplification that might happen is if it ends up being 100th, that could be simplified into a 10th, but we'll get into that in just a minute. So looking at our 82 minus 40, that's going to leave us with 42 hundredths. Okay, so to give you an idea of another way that this could be represented, let's look at 6/10 minus 20 hundredths. So this was the example that I was talking about just a little bit before, that if looking at our hundredths, if they end in zeros, if both the numerator and the denominator end in zeros, you can divide by 10, just like we did up here, to convert your hundredths into tenths. To represent that, instead of adding these zeros to change the tenths into hundredths, I'm going to take away the zeros to change my hundredths into tenths. So now that those are gone, I can simply say 6/10 minus 2/10 is going to give me 4/10. Again, looking at all of these fractions, what we've ended with, yes, they're all even, so yes, you could simplify, but we are not going to. With adding and subtracting of these fractions, we're just going to practice getting to the end point of our 44 hundredths, 42 hundredths, and 4/10, and we're going to leave it like that. Do not simplify these down. Just leave them how they are here. What you're going to be working on today, boys and girls, you do have 2 assignments for today. The first is going to be with adding fractions. The second is going to be with subtracting. If you want to do subtracting first, that's fine. Then go to addition. Either way is fine. But these are the 2 that you have today. As you can see on top, it just goes over a little bit of reminder of what we just did, as well as on the subtraction one. So you have that to reference to as well. As you can also see, you do have 10 problems for each. You have 8 that are just practicing the strategy, and then you do have 2 word problems on the bottom of both worksheets. So again, just kind of going over what we talked about just a little bit ago. Looking at our first one of 6/10 plus 18 hundredths, we cannot convert this down or simplify this down to a tenth because it doesn't have those 2 zeros. So we are going to have to change our 6/10 into hundredths. So I'm going to add that 0 on the end of the 10 and also the 0 on the end of that 6 to in turn make it 60 hundredths. Again, that's just recognizing that we're multiplying by 10 to make those numbers bigger, but again, the value does not change. So now looking at what we have 60 hundredths plus 18 hundredths. Again, adding those denominators is not going to change. And then 60 plus 18 is going to give us 78 hundredths. Looking at the subtraction one, again, we're going to start looking at our hundredths, see if we can't make this a little bit nicer for ourselves. We cannot, because again, there's no 0 on the end of our numerator, so we cannot cross those off to make it into a tenth value. So we are going to have to do the same thing and convert our tenths into hundredths. So just like we did before, we're going to think about that multiplication of multiplying by 10 on the bottom, 10 on the top, to make it be 10 hundredths instead of 1/10. In subtracting, same thing. That denominator does not change, so it's going to stay as 100. 63 minus 10 is going to give us 53, and then that's where we're going to leave our answer. Again, boys and girls, just like we've been doing, do not forget to answer your questions on those Google Forms. If you have any questions, please just let us know. Also, let us know when you're done so we can check your answers and then have conversations.